Welcome back to Normal Islands Live. It's been a while. Actually, it's been a really long time, but we are back. I'm Curtis Daly. I'm your host this evening. I'm also joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, I'm always thrilled to have you on. How are you today?
I'm not doing too bad. Just had some excellent goat's cheese and garlic pasta and
Oof.
looking forward to the show tonight.
Oh God, you got me really hungry then. I was having this
It was good.
conversation with
It was
someone about the
good.
cheese. I love all the cheeses. Actually, what's your favorite cheese?
Feta probably.
Feta's a good one. Do you know what? I could spend the next hour talking about cheese, but we've got some more important things to talk about, haven't we? Yeah.
We do. Plenty on the show to get to.
Stories tonight. Right wingers are losing it at the idea that Labour gets union funding. Universities are facing a crisis. Starmer's polling has declined, and Foreign Secretary David Lammy ignored by Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, up first, the Labour Party are in the pocket of unions. It seems like there is a coordinated media campaign about Labour taking money from unions, and it's framed as if it's corruption. GB News says this. Labour bigwigs accepted 480k from trade unions before capitulating to pay hikes. The Daily Mail, they say half of Labour MPs in pay of unions. Right-wing commentator Tim Montgomery says, show me corruption, please, Twitter, with a screenshot of an article that reads, Cabinet ministers accepted hundreds of thousands in union donations before striking pay deals. Labour's top team have received 480k from their paymasters since 2019. Reform MP Richard Tice, who also shared that same article, said, thought Labour said they would clean up politics and be full of integrity, still in pocket of unions. Now, this story has spread across the press and also into broadcast media. Real life Alan Partridge, Richard Madeley said this.
There is a broad perception, not held by everybody, but certainly quite a large section of the press this morning, that what we're seeing here is payback, that the trade unions bankrolled over half of Labour MPs' campaigns in the last election, and this is now the back being scratched in return.
Helena, I mean, the Labour Party was created by unions. It's no secret union funding happens, but the media and right-wing politicians are acting as this, it's some kind of corruption, right? You heard Richard Madeley describe it as, well, you know, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. What's the controversy here?
I mean, exactly. It's ridiculous. The idea that people didn't know before now that Labour were funded by the trade union movement is ridiculous. And of course, it is the cleanest money. It's the cleanest money in politics. It comes directly from workers in democratic organisations who get to choose where their funding goes. It is, in fact, essentially no different than people being paid members of a political party, which no one seems to really care about. Like, just because it happens to come through the vector of trade union funding and then democratically decided within those unions themselves, suddenly it's about the boss. This is why they say union boss, by the way. They don't want you to think that the people who lead trade unions are people who are elected by members to be the democratic representatives who get to represent the democratic will of the internal membership, making the decision to therefore take some amount of funding and give it to the Labour Party to then be their voice in Parliament. That is not the same as a large individual donation from a big business person. Ironically, of course, that's who Labour get most of their money from now. They get more money from individual donations from people like billionaires and business people than they do from trade unions. But this is beside the point. This isn't dirty money. This isn't a revelation. And this is, of course, how they have been funded for generations. And on the top of this, what's even more silly is that one of the biggest pay deals that we even saw throughout this round of public sector pay deals was the deal that was struck between the Department of Health and Social Care and the junior doctors. The BMA aren't affiliated to the Labour Party. In fact, less than a third of the highest profile trade unions in this country are not affiliated, are affiliated, to the Labour Party. 2/3 are not affiliated. So whilst they may be the trade unions' representation in government, they don't represent all the trade unions, let alone all the trade unions who have been reaching pay deals with the government. And thirdly, after all of this, they've clearly tried to distance themselves from the trade unions throughout their policy making process and how much they snubbed them during the National Policy Forum. Actually, in reality, this is about political expediency, regardless of the cost of the pay deals. It is cheaper to solve the pay deals, or would have been cheaper if we'd solved the pay deals 18 months ago, rather than dragging it out and indemnifying people like the train operating companies like the Conservative Party did. And the cost of actually striking a deal is way less than how much we've wasted fighting disputes. Of course, because this isn't about whether or not the government saves money or not. This is about disciplining organised labour and demonising the concept of organised labour as somehow being political corruption, when really it is just democratic membership.
You make a good point there, because there is a sort of a skewering of what unions are by particularly right-wing politicians or pundits, which is that union boss or union baron. They love to say union baron because they want to try and make it out like there's a false equivalence here. I mean, if you ask either of us, we'll say there's a difference between a political party accepting donations from the fossil fuel industry and then they enact the policies what the fossil fuel industry want, which is at the detriment of the planet and people. And then unions, which isn't one guy or one small group of people seeking profits, it is representation of the workers. And of course there is corruption within unions that can happen, but you're right, it's the cleanest money you can possibly get in politics. But I find it very interesting that some media outlets weren't outraged by billionaire donors joining the Labour Party, because the problem with the Labour Party is not pro-worker enough. I mean, they've been taking billionaires on, they've been taking large sums of money. I mean, people like John Caldwell, Phones for You founder, he backs Labour, and he said it's because the Labour Party supports commercial capitalism. But there wasn't a whole media round attacking Labour for that. So, I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, of course, because the people who are in the media are also beholden to those same interests. At the end of the day, Comcast owns Sky News, the Barclay brothers own The Telegraph, or at least they do it at a time of recording, and Rupert Murdoch owns places like The Sun and The Times. Like, the corporate interests are what is shared between the media and the political parties, like the Conservative Party always has been, and the Labour has become in a post-Starmer world, especially since that they actually share some material interest in terms of being supported by Rupert Murdoch, at least tangentially, during the election. So it's a real kind of turn face to see Murdoch press attacking Starmer over this funding model that they previously had and have kind of moved away from in recent times. It's also really interesting the way they've lined up the attacks as well. What you've seen across the media throughout the times in which they have been doing pay deals with certain sectors is to try and pit the non-unionized workforce against the unionized workforce, saying things like, oh, well, these people aren't getting pay rises because they're not members of unions yet. ASLEF and the BMA get to hold the country to ransom so that they get pay rises. I'm like, what you're doing there is telling everybody else that they should join a trade union. If you're angry that train drivers earn more than you and are striking to be able to get not just better pay, but to retain their terms and conditions, it's really important you understand this as well, is that the deal that was, by you, I mean not you specifically, Curtis, but the reason why the ASLEF was so militant in their strike action, the RMT as well, is that in the Conservative government's Department for Transport negotiations with train operating companies, the mediation of the train operating company dispute with the unions for transport workers, was because they wanted to strip back terms and conditions. They wanted to change the Sunday working hours. They wanted to attack things like pensions and all of the extra benefits that they have for being unionized, something that we took for granted 30 years ago, but has been stripped away by 45 years of neoliberalism. That's why your job at home sucks. That's why the gig economy sucks, is because we don't have broad trade union membership. So by the media trying to say, well, actually, the problem isn't bosses versus workers, bourgeois versus proletariat. The issue is the non-unionized versus the unionized, and the unionized are somehow getting a bigger slice of the pie than they should be determined to have been by the market. When, of course, if you have a problem because you don't get paid enough or your terms and conditions are shit, and unionized workers have better terms and conditions or better pay, just join a trade union. There's a reason why they have much better workers' rights in the Nordic countries, where they have union density over 80%, and we have union density of 26%. Tiny. Under 25s in this country, union density is 9%. Young people watching at home, go out and join a trade union. You need to do it. That's what protects your terms and conditions. You cannot beg your bosses for it. They will not give it to you. You have to organize.
And the thing is, they're so close to getting it, aren't they? Because it's like, I mean, we see a lot on Twitter and social media and GB News, which is that all these train drivers are earning 70k a year and they're still striking. And to pick up on what you said, first of all, a lot of trade union activity isn't necessarily about pay. It's about defending the rights they've won. It's about safety. It's about conditions, because pay is important, but also conditions, people's time. Like when you're forced to work at weekends, do you work for, normal pay, or do you get paid extra? These things are important to people. And they're so close to getting it, because the reason why some union workers are on really high pay is because they're in a union in the first place. Now, obviously, it's a load of bullshit, though, because they don't care about workers' rights. It's not like they're saying, well, we don't like union activity because it stops other people from getting to work. It's not fair on them. Okay, would you support them having more rights? Do you support them having a higher pay? And the answer usually is no. But so you made some really good points there, and it's absolutely essential that people do join a union, because union density is embarrassingly low. I mean, obviously, through Thatcherism, through the 80s, it was decimated, and the countries that have kept their union activity are doing far better. Inequality is down, people's material conditions and the wages are far higher. I could speak to you about unions for hours, I honestly could, but we're already at 7:45, so we will move on to our second story. Now, it seems like that universities may be in crisis. The head of the universities watchdog in England has said the golden age of higher education could be over, and all options should be on the table, as the funding crisis facing the sector is significant. Now, some have suggested that in order to fix this, another increase in tuition fees may be needed. The Office for Students, OFS, interim chair Sir David Behan, said increased tuition fees and lifting visa restrictions on international students could help revive embattled institutions. University leaders have been calling for the raising of the annual tuition fee for domestic students in line with inflation to help institutions struggling financially. The previous government raised the cap on university tuition fees in England to £9,000 a year in 2012, but it has been fixed at £9,250 since 2017. Now, we've had an increase in student fees, as is just pointed out there. The huge jump from £3,000 a year to £9,000. It's a huge jump. It's insane, really. So given the costs have dramatically increased, how are we in a situation where some universities are on the verge of bankruptcy, or they're struggling, and there are calls for even higher fees? Helena, where is the money going?
Well, of course, there is a problem in terms of the structure of these universities, insofar as by liberalizing them and turning them into businesses looking for clients rather than social institutions trying to educate students. What they've done is they've essentially created a cast of kind of wannabe CEOs at the top of universities, spending money on vanity projects rather than on being, I guess, sound managers of the university finances. But trying to pin all of the blame on this on the individual bad actors at the top of universities, I guess there are some problems that systemic at play there too. The real issue, of course, that we've seen in terms of the drop in union money, the drop in university funding, the drop in university funding has come from the fact that we have seen a massive, a stratospheric drop in international students. Visa rules have been restricted to try and appease people who want to see net migration come down. Of course, during the pandemic, this made matters worse during that period too, as we're having for international students as well. But there was after a big glut came in, which led to this very high 700,000 net migration figure, in part due to a rise in student visas. Because this number irritated certain sectors of the public, regardless of whether we were thinking these people were going to leave because they were only going to be here for a certain time whilst they're studying, the number was too big. That was the headline, 700,000 net migration. That has to come down. So they massively restricted the number of international student visas. And what's important to understand here as well is that international students subsidize domestic students in the university sector. Right? They subsidise university students from the UK to have our fees capped at £9,250. Right? They are looking at tuition fee hikes because they're no longer being subsidised by a large number of international students who pay way more than domestic students do. I've seen people talk about, oh, well, that means domestic students having their places taken by international students, when actually, no. The universities want as many students as possible. Of course, they like having international students because it helps fill the coffers, but they're glad to have anybody who's coming here. But in plenty of departments who are not getting the funding that they need, they were really, really reliant on the international students to be able to keep that going. And now we don't have these anymore to appease people over, essentially, again, as just one number being too high, no discussion of the broader problems with this moving forward. We're now looking at some of the most important institutions in this country, which is our university sector, going bankrupt, and there'll be no bailout from the Labour government. They have said the purse strings are closed. If they fail, they fail, and very Thatcherite of the current Labour government. And of course, this is one of our big comparative advantages. Not only do universities employ lots of people, lecturers and cleaners, and all of the people who make these institutions run, really important people in the towns in which they bring economic prosperity to, they help educate our workforce, train our workforce up to tackle the challenge of tomorrow in an ever mercurial labour market that requires having an incredibly well-educated populace so that we can adapt our economy to what is necessary at the time. Also, we make a huge amounts of money from people coming here bringing foreign capital. If they're spending foreign capital in our country for our products, this is an export good. We have a gigantic trade deficit in this country. It is necessary to try and make the levers that are at our disposal be pulled in terms of where we can bring foreign capital in to make our country more prosperous. And our universities are some of the best in the world. Some of the best universities in the world in this country. And we are kneecapping our economy, doing economic vandalism just to try and reduce the number of international students because of net migration figures. It's myopic and ridiculous.
I guess it's kind of an analogy, isn't it, for wider immigration, which is that there's an arbitrary number that a lot of people want to see come down. But what are the effects of it? And as you pointed out here, that foreign students are subsidizing the tuition fees to be low. I mean, obviously, you and I would say £9,000 is a hell of a lot of money, but it's quite cheap compared to what people overseas are paying. And I guess that is an analogy. I know obviously wider immigration is complex, has got different issues to it, but it's economic vandalism if you were to just severely bring down immigration without anything in place. So, but I guess it's still, I mean, the question I have here is, it still seems like a very, very flawed system that we're relying on foreign students coming over to subsidize our essentially funding for university. So, I mean, what's the solution here? Because those of us on the left have called for fees to be abolished, but we're now in a situation where some universities are complaining they don't have enough money. So what is the long-term solution here? And does that include free university?
I mean, I think it might well do. You either get people to pay in terms of tuition fees for their education, or you can subsidize that through the public purse. Either way, the universities still get the funding the same way. But even when we had free university in this country, before Blair's reforms to introduce tuition fees and liberalize the education market, international students still paid tuition fees. Like, the international students still came here bringing foreign capital to be able to have access to some of the best educational institutions in the world. At the end of the day, either fees are going up or central government is going to have to provide funding for these things. Now, you and I here on the left believe in the decommodification of education because we believe that there's a public good. We, in fact, even if you take it from a liberal capitalist perspective, even if you take a liberal capitalist perspective rather than a socialist perspective, and you just talk about the economic benefits of having an educated population, as I mentioned before, all the more reason to try and open up as many places at university as possible for people from whatever background, whether they're poor or whether they're rich. Now, I am willing to hear arguments from people who support tuition fees about how, well, we didn't actually see a reduction in working class people going to university with the fees at £3,500. In fact, we saw a massive increase in working class people going to university because universities chasing money from as many students as possible really kind of lowered their entry requirements a lot of the time. So people who were from disadvantaged backgrounds who didn't have easy access to the best education money can buy from private schools, for example, which were the majority of university applications in a pre-90s world, the entry requirements being lower and the amount of places available being higher during liberalization led to a massive explosion in university attendance in this country, and this made our country better. Again, it helped educate everybody to make sure that they had the tools necessary at their disposal. For social mobility, people from disadvantaged backgrounds were more likely to get a place at university under the new system, and it meant that they had all of the tools necessary to be able to get social mobility, to be able to have one of these high skill, high wage jobs that Boris Johnson told us we'd have, that we now don't have because of their terrible economic reforms. So I would be happy to see university fees go away. We need to ensure we have something in place that means that we still have the number of slots available at university for everybody who wants to go, rather than it being as selective as it was before the 1990s.
I want to pick up on a point you said, because there are, I mean, typically Blairites have called for university tuition fees. They introduced it under Blair, and that was for actually a specific reason rather than just saying, oh, we want to charge people. Because, I mean, you mentioned about the liberalisation of university under New Labour, but I mean, would you call adding fees liberalisation, especially when, I mean, I guess it doesn't have that prestigeness about it as it used to be, which is kind of funny to me. Because if you were to ask me, what would you think where would the prestigeness, for a better word, come from? It'll be from charging people. But it used to be free, and now we're charging people, and more students are going to university, and it's lost that prestigeness. So, I mean, can you sort of explain the pro tuition fee argument and why some people think it's actually a good idea? Maybe they want to reduce it, but they don't want to get rid of it entirely. I know that you've had discussions about this before.
I mean, the very specific difference is that they're treating people as clients rather than students. At the end of the day, they're not chasing, well, they are chasing league tables as such. They do want to see their particular university very high up on the league tables in terms of how the students do academically. But at the end of the day, if one of their material incentives is money, they're going to want to have as many students as possible to get as much money as possible. You know, the overheads don't necessarily go down that much if you reduce student numbers. You still built the labs, you still have all of your lecture theatres, you've still made all of the investment in the day-to-day running of the university. So the opportunity cost of increasing your capacity to be able to get more in tuition fees makes you want to expand further, because it's much more efficient to have more investment and a large number of students than it is to be more exclusive. And that's what happened. I mean, again, the big problem is the hike in student fees and the changing of how we do student finance in this country. Remember that the Conservative government made student loan repayments far more punitive. If anything, like, lots of people never ever paid their student loans back under Tony Blair, and if they did, they paid it back quickly because the interest wasn't as terrible as it has been under the Conservative Party. Again, I personally support free education because I believe it should be decommodified. Of course, I'm a socialist. I believe in the abolishment of the profit motive and the commodity form altogether. But I'm willing to hear arguments from people who think, well, £500 was a reasonable amount of money. It didn't cripple people with debt. It didn't make people have what we're seeing at the moment, where some people who've left universities who are the upper earnings limit for, or some when those are one of the higher tax income brackets, essentially paying an effective tax rate of like 55% in this country. So there are pros and cons either way. And what we did see, what Tony Blair really wanted to do with the increase in university education, not just make people more educated, not just expand the university applications, but also create more Labour voters. That's what it did. Like, people who went to university are far more likely to vote for a Labour government than they are for a Conservative government. And Tony Blair knew this when he tried to maximise the number of people going to university. So there were political and economic reasons for this.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's funny because obviously the people in government now are kind of like blue Labour. I mean, they want to chase these sort of anti-immigration votes. So I wonder if they get that. I don't know. But at least Tony Blair knew ahead. He almost future-proofed his votes in that sense. But like, obviously, we know the social.
I mean, so one to add to that is, ironically, what he's really done is the universities made people so left-wing, not because they're indoctrinating people, but because it was a combination of having access to this place where you get to take in a lot of things you wouldn't otherwise do if you just stayed in one place. You experience a load of new things university you wouldn't do elsewhere. But also the material conditions of the austerity government. He actually probably created a lot of voters who are a bit too left-wing for the Labour Party now.
It didn't create Labour voters, they created progressive voters who moved to the left when it came to the increase in tuition fees and all that sort of stuff. Yes, that was obviously by accident. But it's really interesting when we look at student debt, right? Because you're right, a lot of people don't pay it off, and it seems like a very flawed system when they're talking about the fact that there's not enough funding for universities, yet they're talking about maybe raising fees, but people don't end up paying it back. So it feels like they're not even getting that revenue they need back. Surely it makes much more sense to have, I mean, if you're going to keep tuition fees as they are, right, and to keep the system as it is, surely it makes sense to, when people leave university, have higher paid jobs, people's material conditions are far better, wages are higher, because you're more likely to pay a good chunk of your fees back after university, but there's no sort of aftercare, for want of a better word. People are going to university, spending loads of money, getting themselves into debt, and a lot of them are just going into minimum wage jobs. So it feels like there should be an incentive to make sure that people actually have high quality jobs at the end of it. So actually bring some money back. I'm sure that might have something to do with the fact that universities are not getting the funding they need.
Exactly. There's one really important point here that I need to stress too, is that you hear a lot of people on the right saying too many people are going to university. They should be doing vocational courses. We should expand vocational courses. Absolutely. Being a plumber, being an electrician, these are high quality jobs that are incredibly necessary for society and also well paid because we have a shortage. We need to be sending people to do these things rather than working in retail and minimum wage jobs. But we're not sending too many people to university because we have an educational inflation. What we haven't done is raise the thing called a graduate premium, which is how much extra your earnings potential is by having a degree. We've not raised this because we haven't properly invested. The austerity period essentially took away. We had one of the lowest investment levels in the G7 for a decade in this country because of the austerity years under Cameron and George Osborne, which meant that our graduate premium didn't grow. If you want to compare our economy to the United States, where they had a similar amount of increase in educational attainment during the period where we liberalized our education sector, they had just a similar number of people going to university, a similar number of people doing STEM degrees as well. Like they were doing the same kind of degrees. It wasn't all Mickey Mouse degrees. They saw a similar kind of tapestry of people getting certain different qualifications in their country. Yet because they were still investing, even under George Bush, of all things, they were still running deficits. They were still having their economy investing. They never did austerity in the way we did under both Democrats and the Republicans. So that means that their graduate premium kept increasing. Graduate earnings are still increasing and have been increasing in America year upon year upon year, over the time when we've seen the graduate premium massively fall off a cliff in this country because we haven't been investing because of austerity. Like that is a political and macroeconomic choice made by our government to disenfranchise graduates in this country, which hasn't been done in other countries. So anybody who says to you, we need to stop going, we need to have fewer people going to university, what they actually mean is that they just hate the idea of woke indoctrination universities and they think that's bad. They don't actually understand the economics of this.
It's why they throw in there saying, "Oh, there's a degree for everything now." You know, Mickey Mouse degrees, and the right-wing politicians love that, right? But it's really important to grasp that this is a macroeconomic policy because, I love the way you put it. It's sort of a graduate premium. You know, it's to say like you have a degree, it's actually worth something. And even if I'm just going to go on a personal anecdote, I never went to uni, right? But those around me didn't feel like that going to uni was going to catapult them to something better. A lot of the time, people felt like they didn't know what else to do. There was no jobs anyway, leaving sixth form at 16. And it was a way of like, okay, well, because university is more about education. I think it is about learning about yourself, meeting people and experiences. That's important. But I think people relied on that and they didn't really know where to go afterwards. And now it's even worse due to austerity that after 3 years of going to uni, people don't really have anything afterwards. I mean, when I was 18 years old, I was working in a call center, and it was strange because I had 5 GCSEs, the bare minimum, really. I mean, I got the job through a brother. Let's be honest, it was nepotism, but you know, it's back then it was a £10 an hour a job, so hardly like nepotism on large scale. But I was in the same room with people 30, 40 years old who were massively in debt, who went to uni, who ended up being in the same situation as me. And I expected that these people should be getting higher paid jobs because of it. And it just comes back to the austerity and the fact that there is nothing after these people, and that doesn't help the entire system, doesn't help the funding model, whatever. And I think that's really important, which I don't think gets addressed enough, is that people don't feel like there's a purpose, even when university density has gone up. But I think that people have lost hope there. But we will move on. But before we go on to our next story, I just want to say that if you like what we do, you can subscribe and share our content. Now, there are 5 of us contributing to Turn Left. It's crazy. I mean, a year ago, it was just essentially just me, basically, you know, people helping out now and again. But there's 5 of us. But Turn Left is still completely voluntary. And in order for us to dedicate more time to Turn Left, to upgrade the quality, to become a fully realized media organization, then you can support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month, or any one-off donation at patreon.com/turnleftmedia. Let's grow a socialist media alternative to take on the establishment commentariat, and you could be part of the the journey. Now, I want to go to some of our comments. I have to say, we've got 305 people watching, which, apart from our 12-hour election coverage, is the highest amount of people watching concurrently. So thank you for everyone who's tuned in. But let's have a look at our comments. James Holmes, again, good to see you. Gifted another 10 Turn Left memberships. Thank you so much. It's really appreciated. Gavin Moran, trade unions funding Starmer are complicit in his crimes as well as workers' policies. Okay, that's an interesting question to pose there, isn't it? Are unions complicit in war crimes? If you ask me, I don't think so. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have a very flawed electoral political system, and people need to try and persuade or pressure people to certain positions. And if unions want to try and pressure a very neoliberal Labour government to more pro-worker policies, I don't blame them for trying. Maybe it's a dead end, but I wouldn't say they're necessarily complicit. Stanley Beckett's, good to see you again. The top 20 donors to Labour for the last election included, wait for it, 4 trade unions. Yeah, so actually the Labour Party outspent every other political party, and yes, it was billionaires. But the media doesn't want to talk about that. They'll talk about trade unions, but they won't talk about former Tory billionaire donors. Edward Sexby, good to see you again. Not so hot on questioning funding when it's from the rich, corporations, certain foreign powers, etc. It's almost as if the Labour Party was set up by the union movement to get representation for workers. I know that seems a crazy idea that the party created by unions wants to maybe represent workers. Here at Turn Left, we will talk about the complete contradiction between the media, how the whole party's to account in terms of union funding, but won't say nothing about dark money, foreign money, or billionaires. Les Watts, historically, the union leadership have backed the Labour leadership even when it was against their members' interests. The social contract in the 70s comes to mind. I mean, I guess maybe that could be what I was referring to earlier. You know, are unions complicit in the genocide if they're funding Keir Starmer? I think some unions are unwilling to break away from the Labour Party because they feel like they still have some sort of influence. So there will be some unions that will back Labour regardless. The state of higher education is the result of the privatisation, commodification of education. We should decommodify all of it. Decommodify all of it. Let's go to our last comment. Katie Marshall, good to see you. Hey, look, it works up here in Scotland, charging tuition fees to staff as fuck, especially for societal need, e.g. medical infrastructure, energy. I've not said this one in ages. There is no planet B. Right, you are. If we want an educated workforce, if we want more doctors, nurses, engineers, scientists, then we need more people educated. So I think we should have more access to it. Now, let's go on to our next story. A new poll has been released, which shows that the majority of people think that the country is moving in the wrong direction. More than half of people think Britain is moving in the wrong direction, according to a new poll that shows a drop in favourability of Sir Keir Starmer and his cabinet. The poll by Ipsos, which was conducted between the 9th and 12th of August, shows that people still prefer Labour leaders to Conservative ones, but there has been an increase in criticism of the new government. 52% of adults polled said that they thought Britain was heading in the wrong direction, while 22% said things were heading in the right direction. Sir Keir remains the most popular politician asked about, with 38% of people thinking of him favourably compared to 38% unfavourably. This is, however, a drop compared to his ratings just after the election. His net favourability rating has now gone from +7 to 0, essentially neutral. Now, of course, it's hardly been a quiet 6 or 7 weeks for Keir Starmer. I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, the country was literally on fire and race riots took place. Helena, how much of this is legitimate in terms of criticism of Labour, and how much of this do you think is, out of their hands? I mean, the riots, I think it's a stretch to completely blame Labour, given this was a long time coming. So do you think the party is getting a lot of unfair flack, or do you think they truly handled the riots poorly?
I think there was certainly things that Labour could have improved upon their handling of the riots immediately. Taking a week to call a Cobra meeting, for example, mealy-mouthed comments on the actual nature of the riots, the kind of the terror attacks that we saw over the course of that period. This wasn't a particularly strong response. I mean, Keir Starmer is certainly not an orator. Let's be real. And I mentioned this on stream to Kevin Logan when I was streaming with him at the time, and saying that what the country needs in moments of crisis is a unifying, charismatic figure to be able to bring the country together. And Keir Starmer is neither of those things. In fact, he's a complete non-entity. So he was never going to do well out of the situation being handled in the way that it was. But of course, the fertile ground for the scenes we saw, whilst being aped by Labour, wasn't created by Labour. It was created by the press. It was created by the think tanks. It was created by the Conservative Party, and they were left holding the bag. So I'm not going to lay the lion's share of the blame at their feet. But of course, there are plenty of other things that they have done to piss people off. Immediately coming into government and saying, well, there's no funding for things. We're going to have to let universities go bust. We're going to take away the winter fuel payment from pensioners. Really important voting demographic, especially the kind of demographic that's likely to, I know, answer polls from YouGov and places like that and want to make their opinion known. Attacking this group of people in terms of policy, not a good look. It's not a good look in terms of how you approach governance. They're not coming out all guns blazing, talking about how they're going to fix things. In fact, they're spending the vast majority of their time in government saying that they have no ability to fix anything because the economy was ruined by the previous government. Now, whilst that may be true, the economy was ruined, that doesn't stop them doing things. It doesn't stop them taking a more populist message and saying, well, actually, the problem here is that there's loads of wealth in this country. It's all in the wrong place. We could tax the rich and that would fund the wonderful things that we want to do to improve the country. But they are following a strategy of promising little and then trying to deliver more than they have promised. But at a time where the country seems to be falling apart and people are desperate for actual kind of tangible change, the softly approach is going to wear thin on the public very quickly, especially with a gigantic majority and essentially carte blanche to do whatever they want with over 400 seats in the House of Commons. The more that their time in office stagnates, the more that it feels like that their governance is sclerotic, the more likely the public are to turn against them. They have a very, very limited period to make people's lives better. Let's hope they do.
I mean, I suppose the really important question is, where do we go from here? I mean, what does Labour have to do? One, try and distance themselves from the handling of the riots, and I guess that's if you think they did a really bad job. And secondly, to try and make sure it doesn't happen again, and to convince people that the country is going in the right direction. I mean, what can they do, let's say, in the next 6 months?
It's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, they would have to announce a budget. For me personally, I think most people are still feeling the country is going in the wrong direction because of their own material conditions. That's going to take large-scale investment in things like the NHS, people stuck on waiting lists. They're going to have to, again, try and find... Keir Starmer's going to have to find some charisma from somewhere and speak positively about the country. Right? Rather than denigrating and saying everything is broken, we need to come down hard on these thugs. They need to find a positive message out of this. And rather than saying, oh, isn't it great that the police sorted out the far-right thuggery on our streets? No. It was the solidarity from the community. These were heartwarming scenes of the community coming together to fight up against fascism in this country. And for this not to be acknowledged by the government and celebrating, in fact, the really and truly, there is kind of half or so of Reform UK voters who had sympathy with the rioters. The rest of the country has no sympathy whatsoever and think that they disgrace Britain. All the polling came out. Even Conservative voters are broadly in line in terms of polling with regards to how they view the rioters as Labour and Liberal Democrat voters. They think the rioters shame Britain. They value that this country is seen as being more tolerant, right? Especially when a one nation Conservative voters. There is a real market to bring people together by trying to find a positive out of what's gone on here in terms of the community response. And what has he done? Praised somebody, praised an institution, the police, who on a report card by an independent investigation were found to have got the lowest possible rating for investigating and solving crime. I'm sorry, that doesn't sound like a functioning police force to me, especially when we have to do their jobs for them and stand on our streets to defend them against fascists.
I mean, I guess none of us were surprised that he came out in support of the police. The guy is a cop, right? But what do you make of his very authoritative response? I mean, on one side, it is quite cathartic to see the fash in jail. But at the same time, he's not just going after the race rioters. I mean, there are people of color, there are Muslims who are getting harsh jail sentences. I read one story that the judge said maybe you need to rise above the racism. I mean, someone going to prison for 18 months for throwing a beer can. He's doing an authoritarian clampdown on everyone, on both sides, essentially, not those that are setting fires to hotels. I mean, he's doing that, but like, to me, the context should be, well, the harsh punishment should be on those that instigate the race riots. And if you're protesting and you get into a bit of a kerfuffle, that should be at least understandable. But no, he seems like he's clamping down hard on everyone, which surely that's not going to work, is it?
I mean, unfortunately, whilst I agree with you, I think it's not been done fairly to people who are responding to a race riot rather than people who are outwardly committing one. I think that these sentences have been unfair. But in terms of just the neutral political optics of this, in terms of what he can do to keep his approval rating high and keep Labour popular, unfortunately, this country is a very authoritarian country in terms of justice policy. In this country, people really do want to see harsh prison sentences for everybody. If they see people, regardless of whether the motivation is pure or impure, if they see them on the street committing a fray, which is what a lot of people have been sentenced for in terms of getting into bust-ups with people from the other side of the altercations in this instance, they are not going to really take account of the fact that these were people defending their community rather than those instigating riots within said community. They see people committing a fray and they want to see them punished for the crime that they've committed, especially when they plead guilty to the crime that they've been caught on camera. I don't think there's any political capital for there to be leniency for those based upon the motivations that they had to being there in the first place. So for the optics side of it, I don't think he's got much to gain by being anything less than even-handed on this, especially since there's all this discussion about two-tier policing, which is obviously a bunch of bollocks. But you see what I mean about how it's difficult optically?
Well, I mean, I guess the thing is that he could be, I think he could be lenient on those on the counter-protest side. Again, like the people of color who are getting 18 months for throwing a beer can, standing up against the race rioters. I feel like if you're drowning the news with harsh punishment on the racists, then I'm sure he could probably get away with being lenient on the other side. Now, I get what you mean when people say two-tier policing, but it's kind of like the Republican attack line where they call Obama a communist. They're going to do it anyway, and they're already doing it anyway, even though two-tier policing, it's a myth in some way, but also actually it's kind of true in the reverse. Like when you look at Just Stop Oil protesters who are going to jail for 5 years for doing a Zoom call, right? And then you get in the 2011 riots, people going to jail for stealing basmati rice, and you're getting some thugs who aren't even getting that long in prison for doing much worse. There is a kind of two-tier police in the reverse, right? But they're going to say it anyway. So I completely understand that it's optically it's a very hard narrative to thread, but he could do everything completely right, and the right wing, the reform lot, will attack him anyway. I kind of also want to ask you about communism. We've got literal British MPs saying that we're a communist country now because Keir Starmer is, being very tough on sentences. Are we a communist country?
I mean, what they're doing is confusing authoritarianism for communism. At the end of the day, if we look back, European history, some of the people who've been most persecuted by state action have been communists. I mean, NATO literally funded stay-behind squads in Italy to go and hunt down communists. So we have been at the rough end of authoritarian policy in this country since 1945 onwards. Let's be real. Obviously, there was plenty of authoritarianism in certain communist regimes, right? I'm not saying that the NKV did nothing wrong, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, all of these attack lines aren't going to work because we're not a libertarian country. We are an authoritarian in terms of how the population think. I disagree. I'm a libertarian in terms of my approach to justice policy. I favor rehabilitative justice rather than punitive justice. But I understand I'm in the minority. It's not politically efficacious to not seem to be taking a firm hand when it comes to this action for a politician in this country. And I've just, whilst I try and convince people of my libertarian arguments in this regard, I'm not fighting a losing battle running that on that politically in the current climate. I think Labour would be too.
I think it's hard to convince people, you're living in the communist country because the government's really tough on criminals. And the response to British people was, yeah, good. Because you're right, that's the
Exactly.
mentality we have. We have far less of a sort of libertarian free speech movement over here than we do in the US, although the flag bearers of the free speech movement are capital L libertarians who aren't really free speech advocates. They just want to push their crazy ideas. But it's absolutely true that we do have an authoritarian mindset over here, and the whole communist thing isn't going to work.
It's not.
But I find
Also,
it,
one last point as
hilarious.
well.
Though.
Yeah. One last point as well is with these free speech warriors, for example, saying, how dare the police arrest people for posting, incitement to terrorism on the internet? Yeah, it doesn't matter whether you write it in a letter or whether you say it in the street, whether you write it on the internet, it's still incitement to terrorism.
Yeah.
Do you think all these free speech warriors getting mad at people being locked up for this would have the same reaction if they saw, like Salafi Wahhabists talking about how they needed to commit terror, like about inciting terror attacks on their social media feeds? Of course they wouldn't. They'd be the first to call for these to be locked up or deported, sent back to a country they've never been to, whatever, because they were born in the UK. Like, they are people who are totally hypocritical, who do not take an even-handed approach to these things, like just as all free speech warriors do. They don't believe truly in free speech. They really believe in free speech for them.
Yeah, 100%. Whenever people say, I love free speech, oftentimes it is just their speech and that's it. Because you're absolutely right. If it was a political enemy of theirs and they did something like this, they would absolutely not like it. And I also want to stress as well, I see it so much, people are blindly sharing stories on Twitter. One particular story comes to mind, which is a picture of a guy from Bristol, and he got 18 months, I think, for supposedly grinning at a police officer. And obviously the right-wing media and the right-wing figures like Lawrence Fox are saying, well, this is authoritarian Britain. It takes 2 seconds to Google the story, and it turns out, no, this person wasn't jailed for grinning. He was jailed for kicking and punching officers and police dogs. So literal violence. So that has to be put into context, which a lot of people, they're not saying that. But we are going to move on to our final story of the evening. Now, despite Labour going fairly easy on Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly ignored David Lammy. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu refused to meet British Foreign Secretary David Lammy on Friday during his trip to Israel, according to Israeli media reports. The British government made multiple requests for a sit-down meeting with Netanyahu, Israel's Channel 30 News and the Times of Israel reported. But the government was told Netanyahu had a scheduling conflict. According to Channel 13 News, citing Israeli sources, the Israeli Prime Minister was angered by the new Labour government's recent decision to withdraw British objections to the International Criminal Court deciding on issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. A Foreign Office source told Middle East Eye that there had been no plans for David Lammy to meet Netanyahu. So, as mentioned in that quote, Labour have made some positive steps, including backing the ICC if there were to be an arrest warrant issued. But it seems Netanyahu was throwing his toys at the pram and is likely the reason, it's pretty clear that's the reason why he won't meet with David Lammy. So despite Labour for years backing Israel in their actions, that isn't good enough for Netanyahu. Helena, what implications do you think this will have? And do you expect Labour to fold under the pressure and potentially even drop their commitment to the ICC?
Who knows what their position is going to be moving forward? They flip-flopped like 3 times already over the ICC objections or whatever it is. But at the end of the day, they really have to ensure that they keep with this position. The way in which the West applies pressure to Israel is by playing hardball. In fact, I think the fact that Netanyahu refused to meet David, it's very funny that David, is still desperate to want to meet the guy, with the ICC potential arrest warrant coming down towards him. The fact that desperate to be is still kind of pathetic, but it does show at the very least, if we haven't seen any kind of U-turn here, this could be a change in approach where rather than just essentially saying, pretty please stop the genocide, they say, well, we want to come and talk with you. We want to have a discussion about this, try and get towards a ceasefire, but you can't just get away with essentially making us flout our commitment to things like the Rome Statute, to try and maintain cordial diplomatic relationships. Like, that's not something that we're going to allow you to force upon us. which is a positive development as far as I'm concerned. You know, if they do want to meet him to try and get him to change his position on the ceasefire agreement, which remember, Israel have changed so that it doesn't have a permanent ceasefire. This is why it's likely to be rejected now, because it's been changed after the fact to make sure that we don't actually have a real ceasefire agreement. The only way that this possibly changes is through pressure. It's through playing hardball. It's through making sure that Netanyahu knows that his number of friends globally are dwindling. Although what a signal it does say to the Americans might be a little less relevant when it looks like they're not changing their position after giving $3 billion extra to Israel regardless. So we shall see. I await with bated breath.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions about that, but before I want to note that it's pretty embarrassing for Lammy and for Labour, because look, when they were in opposition, they were incredibly pro-Israel. In government, they have slightly shifted, but I would still say they are a pro-Israel government. But he's been snubs. I mean, you have to wonder, what is the point in trying to appease the US and Israel? And I bring the US into it because we often copy what they do, but it seems like being pro-Israel is all for nothing, because anytime you delineate a little bit, they're angry, they're upset, they don't want to meet you. And yeah, maybe just being tough for them is the only thing that works.
I mean, yeah, like this is how you treat spoiled children. Because that's what Netanyahu is. He's a spoiled child. He's gotten his way for 30 years. He's gotten his way without any kind of pushback at all. And just continually gotten his way, just throwing his toys out the pram and watching his parents diligently picking them back up and saying, "Oh, there, everything's fine. We'll send you another $10 billion worth in aid to be able to commit genocide and apartheid against the Palestinians." And somebody puts up at least a tiny barrier of saying, maybe we shouldn't flout our commitments to the International Criminal Court as a signatory towards it, which the Israel isn't, and drop a legal challenge. It's something very, very, very minor in terms of our personal commitments, because those ICC judgments will go down regardless whether we have a legal challenge or not. So, like, something really small in terms of how Israel might approach us diplomatically is not for Netanyahu to go no contact like an abusive partner. Quote Reginald D. Hunter on that one.
Yeah, I was going to say, quote Reginald D. Hunter.
Yeah, so okay, it just shows Netanyahu is a pathetic man, a really small and pathetic little man who cannot accept anything other than get his own way all the time.
Yeah, and the thing is, it was so obvious for us on the outside. It's like, you can't appease these people. You can't be like, "Oh, ceasefire, please," and "Oh, okay." Like, you have to be tough on them, and that's the thing. I mean, the ICC, symbolically, it feels quite big for me, but materially, it's not. I don't think, because I don't think anything's gonna, even if they actually issue an arrest warrant, I don't expect it to actually happen. So in the broader scheme of things, it's not very significant. Yet he's reacting like that. It's not as if the UK said, well, we're going to cut all diplomatic ties and we're going to cut all funding and all arms, because in terms of the arms sales, I mean, they did sort of, I thought it was weak. They said, "Oh, any offensive weapons," but they call everything defense. So it's not even that much of a strong opposition to them. But I guess it's good though, because if Labour aren't willing to push that far and Netanyahu has already thrown his toys at the pram, maybe in a I suppose, an optimistic way, Labour will respond by saying, "Well, we're just going to push even further then if you're going to act like this," rather than appeasing him. Who knows, though, because you're absolutely right. Labour have flip-flopped so many times on it. Now, I do want to go to some more of our comments. And by the way, there are 340 people watching. This is the highest ever amount of people, again, apart from the 12-hour election coverage, that have been concurrently watching across Twitter and YouTube. And by the way, if you're watching on Twitter, I'm not going to call it Twitter. It's the only dead name I'm happy to do. Let's go to some more of our comments. Stanley Beckett again. Maybe Lammy was going to serve an arrest warrant. I can but dream. Imagine. I mean, I think that's out of all realms of possibility. I mean, could you imagine David Lammy doing that? He's not much of a he's a weather vane, he's not much of a principled politician, but it would be funny. Any more comments? Celadon Faye, I hope I said that right. Throwing a beer can back. That last word is important. It wasn't his beer can, it was throwing him first. Thank you for bringing that up, because that's obviously important. It's essentially responding to violence, not even, I mean, I don't think beer can is that violent, but I guess that's important as well, context. And imagine getting 18 months for throwing a beer can back at someone. It is crazy stuff. Robin Foster, Starmer's failure to acknowledge the part that the public played in quelling the riots is very telling. The establishment must be worried that the public haven't turned right wing. I mean, that is basically the role of all technocratic politicians. They don't want to give credit to those that aren't them. They want to give credit to the institutions like the police. But we all know, none of us are fools. The biggest opposition to the fascists were the anti-fascists, were the trade unions, were the progressives turning up in Walthamstow and scaring them off. And we saw the WhatsApp messages, didn't we? Saying, oh my God, there's loads of them. Any more? Vicky Clee, that dude that took a brick to the family area, briefly united the entire country. Rioters also find it funny. Well, that's good. It was very funny watching a fascist get bricks to the old ballsack. Ed, would sex begin? Unless Starmer is going to actually address the material roots of the multifaceted crisis that afflict this country, who only push it to the far right, we need to defend ourselves against the fash. Not rely on police who are more likely to when the other side went off duty. Helena, I want to get your response quickly to that comment.
Oh, 100% agree. As do the vast majority of societal ills, they have their roots in deteriorating material conditions. 100%. You have to trust ourselves in the absence of the state being willing to help us. And whilst we are on the streets for our communities, as Edward rightly points out, how often do you see the police on the other side of these when they're off duty, when they're not in uniform, wearing a certain other kind of uniform? One might expect.
Some other kind of uniform, indeed. 5-minute revolutionary. I said right before the election that Starmer will not last 5 years, and I've been mocked quite a bit for it. I stand by my prediction, but also he will bring the party low doing it. I think he's going to last more than 5 years, because even his personal polling has gone down. The party polling has started gone down. I mean, there's no opposition anywhere close. You've got, excuse me, you've got Reform increasing in the polling. They're nearly neck and neck with the Tories. And as long as Reform are polling well, the Tories aren't going to get near 30%. So I don't think he's in any danger of losing the next election. I mean, Helena, would you agree with that? Do you think he's still got the second term in the bag? But although, to be fair, it's not even been a year, but I want to get your response on that.
Anything can happen in the next 5 years. We thought that Boris Johnson was going to have a gigantic political career, and then scandals destroyed him and destroyed the Conservative Party, alongside exogenous effects of things like the coronavirus pandemic and the war in Ukraine that hampered the economy for the Conservative Party as well. So anything could theoretically happen, but save big stories that scandalize the Labour government, I 100% expect him to be the Prime Minister at the next election, to run with it for the Labour Party, and to win again, potentially even with an increased majority, as people coalesce around somebody who previously would have been scared to vote for the scary Labour Party, but seeing them in government essentially just being business as usual and protecting the interests of things like mortgage rates, especially since the only party I think really that will challenge them is the Conservative Party. I don't buy the Reform UK could become a new opposition, at least not at this current position in the polls. The Conservative Party aren't going to be able to mount a firm challenge to Labour because their voter base is dying. The biggest sector of the voting electorate that votes Conservative is the over 65s. They're going to be losing some 10% of their supporters by the next election, and that is not an overestimation. There's plenty of stats showing that this is going to be the case. So the Conservatives are going down, not up, especially if they infight in opposition like they did in the Blair years.
I mean, yeah, I agree. Political predictions aren't good, but yeah, I don't see how there's a challenge to Keir Starmer even at the next election. I also think that, I mean, maybe the election results of 2024 with the Tories doing better than expected, and by the way, abysmal, but people were saying that they were going to get less than 100 seats. They got 130, just 131. That was still slightly better than expected, and they've come back from that before. Not saying they're going to come back in 5 years, but I guess maybe in a sense that could lessen the threat of Reform. Who knows? Let's not speculate too much, because we've got another 4 years for that. Now, that is all for tonight. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. We've hit 360 viewers concurrently. So again, thank you so much to everyone. I also want to thank Helena for coming on. Always so glad to have you on with your amazing insights. Remember, if you enjoyed this live show, you can also support Turn Left by hitting the subscribe button. If you like our work and you want us to become full-time, you can support us on Patreon for £3 or £5 per month, or any one-off donation at patreon.com/Turn Left Media. My name's Curtis Daly. Thank you, and see you next time.
Patreon.com, Turn Left Media. Support independent media. Support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you, Turn Left.